All right, hello. Welcome back to another Classic Comics Trek Talk live stream. This week we're taking a look at the second season original Star Trek series episode Metamorphosis. Hello, J Rocker. Good to see you, sir. Hello. And William Graves, thank you for joining me. I haven't seen you before. Thank you for being here. Best Futures. I'm not sure what you mean. Okay, I guess. Please do like the stream while you're here. Please do sub to the channel if you haven't already. Okay, so I guess we'll just go ahead and get into this one. Yeah, so Metamorphosis, honestly, not one of my favorite episodes. Um, so this is the second episode in my coverage of the second season. I am going in production order, just to remind everyone, not in order of like broadcast. So let's see here. Now, as always, I'm going to be reading from Mark Cushman's book. These are the voyages for behind the scenes information. All right, this episode written by Gene Kuhn, directed by Ralph Sineski. And this is from the TV Guide listing on July 13th, 1968. And hail Lord Thoth. Hello, sir. Good to see you. Thank you for coming back. All right. The officers of the Enterprise take part in a strange drama born of an alien's love for a human being. Kirk, Spock, and Dr. McCoy are transporting a critically ill woman back to the starship when a shimmering multicolored cloud draws their shuttlecraft to a remote planet. The sole human inhabitant is now this Star Trek. This TV Guide listing says Ephraim Cochrane. Of course, it's Zephram Cochrane. They misspelled it. Who explains that the cloud, which he calls the companion, saved his life 150 years ago, granting him immortality, and has provided for him ever since. One more fact is chillingly clear: the companion has kidnapped the officers to provide Cochrane with human companions forever. This episode won an Emmy nomination for special effects. So this episode is a love story, pure but not at all simple. The theme and agenda to expose and then dispel racial prejudice. And I get that may be what they're going for, but I don't think it really works. And I'll talk about that after I've kind of gone through the episode. This is another Star Trek that at first appears to be man against beast, but as we discover, it is all about a man pitted against himself. Zephram Cochrane, an ambitious man who lived for science and then traveled into space to die alone, must overcome his own rigid thinking and prejudice if he is to finally experience love. True love. Metamorphosis is not driven by action or accented with humor, and therefore may not jump to mind for many fans compiling a top 10 list of favorite Star Trek episodes. Yet all the elements, purposeful writing, sensitive acting, inspired direction, stylistic camera work, lighting, and set design combine in tasteful harmony. This gentle, heartwarming tale is certainly among the series' best. I don't know about that. I would question that. During season one, Gene Kuhn, under pressure from NBC, had a hand in rewriting The Alternative Factor. The original script for that episode featured an interracial love story, which was subsequently removed. The architects of Star Trek, with that episode, and by showcasing a sexual attraction between a white man and a black woman, had forgotten the first rule in imitating the works of Jonathan Swift: to comment on the hot issues of the day by staging them in a time and place and in a way which was alien to conventional thinking. Only then could taboo subjects be broached. Now, 6 months older and wiser, Kuhn took a page from Swift for this approach to a truly mixed romance. Through the course of the story, we meet three unforgettable characters: the lonely Zephram Cochrane, the unloved Nancy Hedford, and the companion, a diaphanous cloud that encircles and protects Cochrane. The surprise is that the companion is female and it loves the man. All three characters affect Kirk, Spock, and McCoy profoundly. This delicate story about unselfish and pure love will touch your heart. I don't know. I guess I have a cold, stony heart because it doesn't touch me that much. Okay. All right. We'll get into it here. So this episode opens with in the shuttlecraft, and this is actually one of the few episodes that doesn't open on the Enterprise. In fact, I believe it. This is the episode in which it takes. It's like I think 27 minutes in before the Enterprise appears, and that's the longest of any original series episode for the Enterprise to appear on screen. So Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are in a shuttlecraft, and on board is Starfleet Commissioner Hedford, who has contracted a rare illness called Securo's disease, I think they call it. She was mediating some dispute between a couple of warring planets or something like that. They don't really go into any specificity. And this is interesting because we see a woman in a position of authority pretty much for the first time, I think. You know, we really haven't seen a woman with because she is arguably of higher authority than they are. You know, we had the one episode, I think it was Court Martial, where, you know, the prosecutor was a woman, one of Kirk's ex flame, of course. But other than that, we really haven't seen women in a lot of positions of authority, and so now we're getting one. And they are taking her to the Enterprise for treatment. Of course, one could question why it's necessary for the captain, first officer, and the chief medical officer to all be in the shuttlecraft. Now, it makes sense for Bones to be there, of course, but do Kirk and Spock both need to be there for this? You know, it doesn't really seem like it. Although that is in part because of the way this episode was rewritten. I'll get to that later. So they detect what seems to be a cloud of ionized gas. They try to veer away, but the cloud moves back into their path and causes their controls to malfunction. And then it seems to pull them off course in another direction. Yeah, and Bones is like, Jim, we got to get her to the Enterprise. And I mean, Kirk's like, yeah, what do you want me to do, man? Okay, and again, as mentioned, this is written by Gene Kuhn, directed by Ralph Sinensky. This is his second episode. He also directed the first season episode, This Side of Paradise. So the shuttle lands on an unnamed planet that has an Earth-like gravity and atmosphere. Kirk tries contacting the Enterprise, but nothing works. There's no propulsion, no communications, no nothing. They depart the shuttlecraft to look around and inspect the shuttle, finding that there is no damage, and yet the shuttle systems are all non-functional. And they're trying to figure out what they should be doing when they meet what appears to be a human male. He introduces himself as Cochrane and claims that he has been marooned on the planet for some time. He also tells them that they likely are not going to be able to get their shuttle working again, claiming that there's some kind of dampening field on the planet. Kirk tells Cochrane about yeah, and he takes immediately takes a liking to Commissioner Hedford. He's been alone for a while, so he's yeah, just he's glad to see a woman for a change. Kirk tells Cochrane about the cloud that pulled them off course, and Kirk asks Cochrane to explain how he came to be marooned on the planet. Cochrane really won't say much other than that he was marooned and many years ago, and again that there's a dampening field that prevents ships from working. So while Spock is showing Cochrane the shuttle, Kirk and McCoy discuss Cochrane, and they both agree that he seems to be hiding something, and also agree that he seems familiar somehow. And of course, I mean, we Star Trek fans, we all know who this guy is. Um, McCoy reminds Kirk that Commissioner Hedford is seriously ill and she's going to die within hours if she doesn't receive medical treatment soon. So Kirk feels like they don't have much of a choice except to accept Cochrane's offer of hospitality. They go back to Cochrane's place, and shortly after arriving, Hedford begins to exhibit a fever and isn't feeling well, and that's the early stages of the disease. Now, Cochrane also has some technical parts laying around, and Kirk calls them antiques because they're many, many, many years old. Now, Spock, who has been lingering in the doorway, calls Kirk and McCoy over. They both look out and see the cloud that pulled them off course, and then it vanishes. They ask Cochrane to explain, but Cochrane is evasive about it. Finally, Kirk demands an explanation. Cochrane tells them that he calls the gaseous entity the Companion, and that it brought him to the planet years ago after his ship was disabled in space and he was dying. When Kirk asks why he was dying, Cochrane explains that he was an old man and the Companion made him young again. They want to know more about the Companion, but Cochrane tells them he doesn't really know what the Companion is exactly, only that it takes care of him and that he can communicate with it and it seems intelligent. Kirk asks him what his first name is, and Cochrane, of course, tells them that his name is Zephram. And Kirk and the others realize that they're speaking to Zephram Cochrane, the man who discovered the space warp or invented warp drive, as it was later established. And the others are incredulous, as this means that Cochrane would have to be over 150 years old. And they're skeptical about this, but Spock notes that Cochrane's body was never recovered. McCoy examines Hedford, and her fever is increasing, and Bones tells Kirk she's going to die within a few hours without treatment. Then Cochrane reveals that the Companion brought them to the planet to end his loneliness. He told the Companion that he basically didn't want to go on anymore if he had to be alone, more or less. And so instead of letting him die, the Companion brought them there to keep him company. And when Hedford hears this, she freaks out. She becomes hysterical, and McCoy has to sedate her. Although, to be fair, considering that she knows she's going to die in a few hours if they don't get her treatment, she's handling it pretty well. Now, Spock goes to the shuttle and attempts repairs, and Kirk asks Cochrane to help them get off the planet, and he agrees. At the shuttle, the Companion appears and attacks Spock, and then it sabotages the shuttle. Now, Kirk asks Cochrane if the Companion can treat Hedford's illness. And Cochrane says he isn't sure, but he agrees to communicate with the Companion and find out. Cochrane calls the Companion to him with his mind, and it appears and envelops him. Kirk and McCoy observe that Cochrane and the entity seem to have a symbiotic relationship. Afterward, Cochrane reveals that the Companion can't help Hedford, or at least that's what it says. Now, at the shuttle, and there's a rather abrupt cut here. There's a couple of abrupt scene changes in this episode, and it's clear that this episode was originally longer and it's been trimmed down a good bit, it seems like. And this is one of them where they're talking about Hedford, and then suddenly we cut to McCoy, who's at the shuttlecraft. He finds Spock, who is recovering, and Spock says that the Companion gave him an electric shock. And then they realize that if this thing is mostly an electrical field, maybe they can short the electrical field, i.e., killing it, possibly. So, let me. Now, Spock constructs a device and suggests that they can activate this device and it will disrupt the Companion's electrical field. Now, they ask Cochrane to call the creature to them. Or, well, actually, they don't ask him yet, but I mean, he can guess that's what they want. But when they talk about harming the companion, Cochrane is not happy about it and refuses to participate at first because, as he says, this thing, it made me young again. It's taken care of me. I owe it a good deal and I don't want to hurt it. But they point out that they're going to do whatever they can to get rid of this creature because it's keeping them from leaving, and Hedford's going to die if they don't. And eventually, Cochrane reluctantly gives in and agrees to call the companion to him. So he summons the companion. Spock activates the device. It seems to harm the companion somehow, and Cochrane collapses. Then it turns on Kirk and Spock, and it attacks them. And I think McCoy says that it's choking them. I mean, it's not clear exactly what it's doing. But Cochrane awakens, and then he calls the companion back to him, so it ceases attacking and returns to him. And at this point, Kirk says, what can we do? How can we fight that? Oh, yeah, and it destroys the device also. It destroys that device they built. So they can't use that anymore. And Kirk says, how do you fight this thing? And McCoy says, well, maybe we should not be trying to fight it. Maybe we should try to try and reason with it. And that's when Kirk has an idea, and he tells Spock to go back to the shuttlecraft and get the universal translator. And Spock says, well, the translator isn't really made to work on something like this creature. And he says, well, maybe you can modify it. And Spock, of course, is like, oh, I suppose it's possible. And so he goes to get the translator. Then we go to the Enterprise. Aboard the Enterprise, Scotty is in charge, in command. And they've, of course, come looking for the shuttlecraft since it never arrived at the rendezvous point. They've been following the shuttle's ion trail or something like that. And eventually the ion trail comes to a stop and they're not sure what to do. And so Scotty says, we'll just keep following on this same heading and hope that we can find them. There's nothing else we can really do. We go back to the planet. Cochrane has summoned the companion again, and then Kirk uses the modified universal translator to speak to the companion. And the companion speaks, and of course, they note that the companion has a female voice. And this is one of the things I kind of have an issue with the episode, and I mean, I'll get into it later. But it's like, how is this thing female? It's a cloud of gas, basically. How is it female? But anyway, as they talk, now earlier in the episode, Kirk and McCoy had speculated that the relationship between Cochrane and the companion wasn't what they initially thought it was. They thought it was more like the companion was keeping Cochrane here out of curiosity, or kind of like keeping Cochrane almost like a pet. But then when they first see Cochrane and the companion, kind of in this kind of communion they speculate that this is more like a relationship between lovers, which I don't know. To me, that's quite a leap to make. I don't know how they come up with that. But anyway, now speaking with the companion and realizing it's female, they now draw the conclusion that, yeah, we were right. This thing's in love with Cochrane. So they have a discussion with the companion, and they try to convince the companion to let them all leave. But the companion, of course, refuses, saying that the companion has told it that he will die if he remains alone. And so she says, or it says, that, the man must continue. And for the man to continue, you must be there to keep him company. So you're going to stay here, and they mention the woman that is dying, and she, the companion doesn't really care. And then the companion leaves. And at this point, they tell Cochrane, that the companion seems to be in love with you. Cochrane is a bit outraged by this. He's basically like, that's disgusting. You're telling me this thing wants to be my lover or whatever, and he basically wants nothing more to do with it. And he angrily storms out. Now, Hedford, who is lying on a bed nearby, she hears him and she calls McCoy over, and she talks about kind of how ironic it is. She's basically focused on her career because, she's a strong, independent woman. And she's never known love. No one's ever loved her. And yet here is Cochrane, and he has this other being that loves him. And yet he rejects that love and wants nothing to do with it. Now, back on the Enterprise, after continuing on that heading, they come to what appears to be a large asteroid field of some kind. They scan them and find, I don't remember the number, but there's a lot of them, a percentage of them that have like oxygen atmosphere and have gravity, basically that people could be surviving on. And so they decide to start checking those. Meanwhile, back on the planet, Cochrane has some of the companion again. And again, it's kind of like there's an abrupt cut here because after his previous discussion about the companion, it seems like they would have had to do some convincing to get him to call the companion back. But instead, here it is. And then Kirk gives a bit of a speech to the companion, telling the companion that, the man is going to perish if the companion won't let him leave. And of course, it argues, he doesn't age. As long as he stays here, he'll survive, and the man must continue. And then he talks about how humans are really, they kind of thrive under adversity, and they thrive when they have obstacles to overcome and things to difficulties to deal with. And the companion takes all that away and again argues that Cochrane will eventually perish if he goes on like this. And then it asks the companion, do you love the man? And it doesn't understand what love is exactly, but then asks, is he more important to you, more important than anything? And the companion says he is. And then says, but you can't, you may possess him, want to possess him and want to keep him, but you can't really love him. You can't really be with him. And because you're not human, you're too different. And then the companion says, well, if I were human, then could there be love? And then it disappears. And they're trying to figure out what to do next. And then they hear a voice, and there is Hedford, who now seemingly is no longer sick, and she's speaking in a different voice. And they discover, well, McCoy checks her, and she no longer has any sign of the illness. And that's when they realize that the companion now inhabits Hedford's body, possessing her, in effect. And, this seems to contradict the earlier statement that the companion couldn't heal her illness because it inhabited her and now she's fine. And basically, the companion has entered Hedford's body, and saying that Hedford was going to die. She was about to perish if the companion hadn't inhabited her. And, there is, of course, kind of a moral question here, because this alien just appropriates her body, basically, without her consent, you could say. And of course, it did this so that it could be human and it could be with Cochrane, but Cochrane is kind of wary of her. And then the companion tells Kirk that the shuttle will work now and their communication devices will work again, and he can contact a ship. Then Cochrane and the companion decide to take a walk together and talk and decide what they want to do. Back on the Enterprise, they finally hear from Kirk, and they get a lock on his position and say that they can be there in about an hour. And then we go to the companion and Cochrane. Now, the companion tells Cochrane that she cannot leave the planet. If she leaves the planet for more than a few days, that she will perish. So she's going to have to stay. And this planet is way out in the middle of nowhere, so it's not like she can go to some colony and stay there and commute back and forth or something. And of course, Cochrane struggles with this because he's now kind of fallen for her and doesn't want to leave. So he returns to Kirk and the others, and Cochrane tells them he's staying, that they're both going to stay. And apparently now that the companion is no longer in its kind of alien state, it's now in Hedford's body. It no longer can keep them young, so they're going to age normally, and they'll live out a normal span of years and then die. And Cochrane accepts this, saying, that's no more or less than any other man or woman. And Kirk accepts this, and then they prepare to leave. And Cochrane tells Kirk, please don't tell anyone I'm here, because, of course, he's a very famous figure. And I guess he just wants to live in peace and in anonymity for the rest of his time. And Kirk agrees to this. Of course, then McCoy points out, yeah, what about that war? That she was negotiating a war. What are we going to do about that? And Kirk really just kind of hands waves that away. He's just like, yeah, I'm sure they'll find another woman to deal with that, which I don't know why it has to be another woman. I don't know. But I mean, it seems to me like it's going to take more of an explanation for Starfleet to accept this. I mean, what is he going to tell Starfleet? Yeah, we got pulled off course by something and then landed on this planet, and then Commissioner Hedford died, and the end. It seems like it's going to be hard for him to not reveal Cochrane's presence, but whatever. And they return to the Enterprise, and it ends there. Okay. Oh, and yeah, I'll give this one. I'm going to give this one a C. Like I say, it's not one of my personal favorite episodes, and really, aside from establishing Zephram Cochrane as the guy who invented warp drive, basically, it really isn't a particularly significant episode. Although I will say, in this episode, at one point Cochrane asks Kirk what's it like out there in the galaxy now, and he talks about the Federation, and I think for the first time he mentions, I think he says that the Federation is composed of thousands of planets. I think he said, which I don't think I've ever heard of it being thousands. Hundreds maybe. But he kind of paints a picture of what the galaxy is like, that we really haven't gotten that in depth of detail before. He talks about how it's composed of thousands of planets and they're pushing out in all directions, and the galaxy is teeming with life. There's lots and lots of other races out there, etc. Okay. So, Metamorphosis was Gene Coon's fourth original screenplay for Star Trek. As with his other episodes, Arena, The Devil in the Dark, and Errand of Mercy, there is a strong message fused with a powerful and imaginative science fiction story. In the previous episodes, the theme had to do with man overcoming racism. That theme is present here too, but this time Coon delivers his statement with a sentimental touch. Quote, "It was a really lovely story and a very touching one," said Dorothy Fontana. "I think Gene did it with great deftness and delicacy." Coon finished his story outline on April 7th, 1967, nearly a month before production was due to resume on the series for its second season. Let's see. Okay, so Coon finished his story outline on April 7th. Yeah, I got that. A few days later, Robert Justman wrote to Gene Coon, quote, "I have read Metamorphosis and I like it very much. Naturally, it is not an action piece, but if you can think of anything to get some action into it, it wouldn't hurt." But just as Justman predicted, Stan Robertson at NBC was concerned over the lack of excitement of the story. And the network man had another concern, which he discussed with Coon one day earlier on the telephone. Quote, "As we agreed, rather than becoming involved in what could be a touchy moral argument and a question of religious ethics, you will not have the companion take over the body of Nancy after her death." Because apparently in the original episode, Hedford dies actually, and it's after that that the companion takes over her body. Instead, prior to Nancy's death, while she is still ill, you will have the companion merge with Nancy and become part of her and the life she will lead with Cochrane. This change, Robertson believed, would prevent offending certain religious groups. Kuhn dashed off a first draft script dated April 14, 1967. Addressing Robertson's concerns about a need for more action, he had the companion deliver an electric shock to Scotty outside the shuttlecraft, who would later become Spock. Also, when Kirk, Spock, and for this version Scotty attempt to short out the creature, she retaliates and attacks, subjecting them to near suffocation. So, in the original or earlier versions of the script, it's Kirk, Scotty, and McCoy who are on the shuttlecraft. And they later, of course, made that change. They took out Scotty. They put Scotty because what had happened is Dorothy Fontana read the script, and I guess she noted that in this script, Scotty gets attacked and like rendered unconscious, but they do that to him in a couple of other episodes. And because of that, she suggested maybe we should change that and make it somebody else. And that's why they wound up putting Spock in there instead. Because I guess originally Spock was back on the Enterprise. The Universal Translator finally makes an appearance in Star Trek. The device had always been planned. Roddenberry, Justman, and Kuhn were well aware of how reality was suspended whenever aliens spoke English. So, and of course, it looks like a flashlight or something, or maybe a lightsaber. Let's see. I mean, there's an image of it, but it's not a good picture. There we go. Roddenberry, Justman, and Kuhn were well aware of how reality was suspended whenever aliens spoke English, but for the benefit of the TV audience, for the sake of telling a story simply and to the liking of NBC and its advertisers, aliens such as those seen in Return of the Archons and A Taste of Armageddon spoke as contemporary Americans would. In the companion's case, with a creature lacking vocal cords, the translator seemed a suitable solution. Kuhn even had a theory as to how it could work, explaining the device to Cochrane. Kirk says, quote, there are certain universal ideas and concepts common to all intelligent life. This device instantaneously compares the frequency of brainwave patterns, selects those ideas and concepts it recognizes, and provides the necessary grammar. Pete Sloman at DeForest Research argued against Kuhn using the device. Oh, and Eddie, hello, Eddie. Thank you for being here, sir. I always thought it looked like an electric razor. Yeah, I mean a little too long and not broad enough, I would think. Um, so Pete Sloman at DeForest Research argued against Kuhn using the device. In an interview for this book, Sloman said, quote, they tried a lot harder at Star Trek than they did at Lost in Space and some of the other shows to get the science right. But if there was ever a conflict between drama and science, drama won. And I understand why it has to be that way because you're not getting an audience of particle physicists. You're getting an audience of everybody out there, and they have to understand what's going on. And even in good science fiction, you have to do science that later turns out to be wrong. But there were some times when they just have to have a particular thing happening. My biggest gripe about any science fiction gadget on the show was the universal translator. It's impossible. There's no way to explain it unless the device itself is telepathic. It just can't work. But Kuhn could not have told his story without it, Sloman added. Quote, Gene Kuhn gave me a statement which epitomized what I personally found annoying about science fiction on television, including Star Trek. But I understood. I called him up and said, Gene, we're 230 years or whatever it is in the future at this point. Don't you think the metric system may have taken over by then? You're still using pounds. And he said, Pete, we don't want it to be authentic. We want it to sound authentic. That's it. And despite that, I met a lot of scientists and engineers who loved the show, even though they knew it was wrong. After getting feedback from his colleagues and ignoring that feedback from DeForest Research, Kuhn revised his script, um, and with a final draft coming in just 2 days before filming would begin. Oh, yeah, here it is. Yeah, so DC Fontana read the latest version because she was the script editor at this point and told her boss, quote, "May I suggest Jim Doohan's going to get very sick of being zotzed, however she means it, getting shocked or getting fried. This is the third property we have with this happening, albeit it is the first we're going to shoot. The other two are The Changeling and Who Mourns for Adonias. If we can't change this, let's consider changing that point in the other stories." Kuhn preferred Scotty getting zapped in the other two stories, so he made a change here, having Spock take the voltage instead. He went one step further and took Scotty out of the shuttlecraft and off the planetoid altogether, putting him back on the Enterprise. Other changes that were made in the rewrites. The shuttlecraft was originally going to be called the Edison. So let me yeah, there we go. So the shuttlecraft was originally going to be called the Edison, but it was changed to Galileo so they could use the recycled footage from the Galileo 7. Commissioner Hedford, in previous drafts, didn't become sick until after the shuttlecraft was forced down on the planetoid. Now, creating a much more effective ticking clock or illness serves as a catalyst for the story, the reason the shuttlecraft is racing to reach the Enterprise in the first place. Cochrane was played much more cooler. In previous drafts, when learning about the companion's gender and love for him, he had reacted far more violently. He flew into a rage, threw rocks, and even attacked the companion with a club, which makes no sense since it's a friggin' cloud, but whatever. This tantrum had ended Act 3. The merging of Nancy Hedford and the companion didn't happen until nearly the end of the story. Now it is the merging of these two which ends Act 3, a far more sensitive handling of the story. This sensitivity extends into the new Act 4 as Cochrane struggles with his prejudice and comes to terms with his own feelings and his love for this alien. As had happened with The Devil in the Dark and Errand of Mercy, no one else on staff other than giving feedback was involved in the writing of this script. As things turned out, NBC should have been happy. Throughout the first season, Stan Robertson had been asking for different types of stories: planet shows, atypical shows, important shows, shows with named guest stars, and shows that began with something or anything other than a shot of the Enterprise in space. He got all of these with Metamorphosis. Yeah, here of the latter request, the Enterprise isn't seen until 20 minutes into the episode, the only time the ship is absent for that long in the series. Now, Ralph Sineski, who directed, and as I mentioned, he did This Side of Paradise previously, returned for his second Star Trek assignment. Regarding the script for Metamorphosis, he said, quote, "It was written by the incomparable Gene Kuhn and was spooky and eerie and had a potent message. I was really anxious to make this voyage." I guess he was on those I guess he was on those amphetamines that he liked to take. Regarding Stan Robertson's desire for name guest stars, now he would get two. Glenn Corbett, let me see if I can find him. Go back a bit. Here he is. So Glenn Corbett, cast as Zephyr Cochrane, was 37. He gained stardom when he was hired to replace George Maharis on the popular CBS series Route 66. As Lincoln Link Case, Corbett sat in the passenger seat of a Corvette next to Martin Milner during the series' final year and a half. Ralph Sineski knew Corbett from that series, having directed a couple of episodes. Route 66 was actually Corbett's second series. He was the lead in a short-lived sitcom, It's a Man's World, from 62 to 63. His third series, which ran for one season a year before this episode of Star Trek, had Corbett saddling up on a Western called The Road West. Quote, "I had no trouble getting actors interested," casting director Joe Agosta said. Quote, "Star Trek offered them interesting roles. But our casting budgets were low with a $2,500 top. One $2,500 top, not two. So I try making the 2 or 3 picture deal and put them in a Mission Impossible or an episode of Mannix as well. It works sometimes, but not with all of them. So I'd have to beg the production manager to pull money out of the set so that I could afford to hire certain actors, or I'd have nothing left for the 10 or 20 smaller parts I had to fill. And Jay Rocker says we can thank the universal translator for Google Translate. Yeah, and there's those handheld devices. I forget the name of it, but there are handheld translators now. You know, I think obviously they're not they're more limited than a universal translator, but I've seen commercials for devices where you can, and usually when I see it, it's like in Asia, like in Japan or something, and someone will say something, and then the device will say hello or whatever. Another good example of Star Trek's technology affecting real world technological development. Of course, there's a number of those. Fortunately, this episode didn't have those 10 or 20 smaller parts, so DeGosta was able to budget 2,500 for two guest stars. It was the casting of the second star to play Assistant Federation Commissioner Nancy Hedford that would raise a few eyebrows. Uh, Let me bring her up. There we go. So Eleanor Donahue was 30 and best known for playing the extremely likable and youthful characters on TV sitcoms. She was only 17 when she first played Betty Anderson in 1954 on TV's Father Knows Best. Well, you'd never get a show called that these days, would you? That job lasted 5 years and 192 episodes. Next, she moved to the Andy Griffith Show playing Ellie Walker. And, I thought she looked familiar. And it wasn't until I read the book that I realized, yeah, she was Ellie on the Andy Griffith Show. And the cell phone. Yeah, the cell phone too. And tablets and pads, handheld pads and stuff. As Ellie Walker, the girlfriend of Sheriff Andy Taylor during 1960 and 61. A third sitcom, Many Happy Returns, which ran from 65 through 66, had her playing the daughter of series lead John McGiver. Choosing Donahue for the role of a dying and bitter woman was a stunt referred to in the entertainment business as casting against type. When the idea of hiring Don, and it's funny, they've got a TV guide cover. I guess it's a one that's got Donahue on the cover of it. But up at the top of the cover, it says, why women play bridge better than men. Okay. When the hiring of Donahue for Metamorphosis came up during a meeting between Gene Kuhn, Ralph Sineski, and Joe DaCosta, it was decided to bring forward Star Trek's Big Gun to sell the idea to the actress. Donahue was married to Harry Ackerman, former vice president of CBS, and at this time head of production for Screen Gems, the number one producer of sitcoms for the three networks. Roddenberry had worked for Screen Gems, making pilot films in the late 1950s and early 60s. So instead of casting director Joe DaCosta, he would be the one making the call. Donahue said, quote, Mr. Roddenberry called and asked if I would be interested in doing a role in Star Trek. And he explained it to me, and it was because I wasn't familiar with the show. He described the character to me, and I said, that would be fun. I was pretty much retired then because I was having babies. It seemed like every year I'd just do one fun something other role, and Star Trek was the one for that year. And it was fun. I've never played two characters at once, Hedford and the companion, and it was probably the first time I had the opportunity to play someone who was a little brusque and uptight and angry, as Commissioner Hedford was. Let me take a drink of water right quick here. Hold on. Okay. Let's see. All right, so casting against type is a gamble that fails nearly as often as it succeeds, which is why the Star Trek staff felt it would take a small miracle or a phone call from Roddenberry bypassing Donahue's agent to overcome any resistance. When Donahue received the script, she knew she had made the right decision. She later said, quote, the script was just beautiful, wonderful statements being made. Nearly the entire episode was shot on Stage 10, Star Trek's Planet Stage, which also housed the shuttlecraft. After the wide open spaces Ralph Sinensky had enjoyed with This Side of Paradise, he now had to rely on his own inventiveness and that of cinematographer Jerry Finnerman to overcome the confinement of the stage. Note the camera views of Glenn Corbett through a hole in a rock formation as he approaches. Yeah, and I believe, let me see. I've got that shot in. Yeah, that's the shot right here. If you can see it, it's a little dark. But yeah, it's an interesting shot with Cochrane there in the foreground. Or actually, well, it's the rock formation that's in the foreground. He's kind of in the midground. Okay, this clever shot was necessary to conceal the limitations of the stage walls. So they put this stuff up around because if you could have actually seen what was like over here or up here, you would have seen the walls of the studio because the set wasn't that big. Oh, hey, Guagnar. Hello. Thanks for stopping by, sir. Good to see you as always. Okay, now I'm not going to go through the whole production or anything. Okay, so interesting note, this is the first episode of the series that Kirk never appears on the Enterprise. He's off the Enterprise for the whole show. Uh, Eleanor Donahue quickly learned that doing anything for the first time could be immensely challenging. Concerning her character, she said, quote, "The opening scenes where she was tough and being very liberated were very hard for me," unquote. Regarding the scene where Kirk speaks to the companion, Donahue recalled, "They made sure that I knew my voice was not going to be that of the entity, but something which was truly fun was I got to do the dialogue with Mr. Shatner while they were filming his scene where he was talking to it. I stood on a ladder so he could look up at me, and I did the dialogue with him. I had learned a long time ago from Robert Young and Jane Wyatt to stay on set for that. They were there all the time to do off-camera dialogue with us. They were very specific about that. They never walked away, so that's what they taught me." Among the fine performances, including those of Glenn Corbett and Eleanor Donahue, that of William Shatner must also be cited. Watch as he pleads his case with the companion, expressing his beliefs concerning human needs and the love between a man and a woman. The excellent wording came from Gene Kuhn. The delivery is pure Shatner. Ralph Sinensky remembered, quote, "Bill Shatner was a fine actor. The day he did that scene where he talked to the companion with the translator, and after the take, Gene Kuhn in the screening room said, quote, 'That's why we pay him the big money,' unquote. No one could have done Kirk the way Bill did," said George Takei. "His energy, his vitality, his passion, and his supreme self-confidence. That's Bill and that's Captain Kirk." Obviously, this was written years ago before he and Takei wound up at odds. Eleanor Donahue had stepped off into a strange new world. The set designs and lighting techniques certainly contributed to putting her on unfamiliar ground, but her greatest memories came from interacting with the Star Trek regulars. She said, quote, "All the actors were absolutely terrific towards me. Leonard was a little on the distant side, but I think that was more the character he was playing and him trying to stay in that frame of mind, so he wasn't real friendly. But the crew, Doc, and all those others, they were just darling. Except for Mr. Shatner. He was a little off with me from the get go. It felt as though he was looking down at me, as if I wasn't quite up to snuff, and maybe I wasn't. I don't think personally I was the world's greatest actress, but they wanted me, so there I was." Shatner had been a serious actor of the stage and a star of a somber and message heavy series called For the People. Eleanor Donahue was, simply put, known for her work on sitcoms. Metamorphosis was an excellent script filled with subtle themes that Shatner had fair reason to believe Donahue would not be able to handle. Quote, Donahue remembered, "At the table reading, I didn't pronounce Glenn Corbett's character's name correctly, and Shatner got very upset about that. Finally, the director stepped in and said, 'Will you just knock it off? Just leave the lady alone, Bill.' He really told Shatner off, and he did stop after that." Ralph Sineski said, quote, I thought Eleanor Donahue did a fine job. I think the last scene she does with Glenn, she was just really lovely in it. Sineski was taken by both of his guest stars, saying, quote, I'd worked with Glenn on Route 66. I directed him in the two-part episode which introduced his character, and he was good in that, but he's better on Star Trek. Looking back at that show now, I can see that he was a better actor than I realized at the time that we were doing it. And at that time, I knew he was good, but now I look at it and I can see that he was better than good. He had a nice personality and he was very professional. Donahue said of Corbett, quote, he was extremely nice. We enjoyed doing our scenes together. He was wonderful. The scene that we did where I was leaning up against the tree was probably one of the most memorable ones that I did with him. And that's towards the end when she's admitting that she can't leave the planet. I believe that's the scene she's talking about. Let's see here. The final role cast in Metamorphosis came after principal photography ended. That role went to Elizabeth Rogers, who provided the voice of the companion. The 33-year-old had been playing minor parts for producer Irwin Allen on his various series, as well as numerous voiceover jobs. Elizabeth Rogers said, quote, as I recall, Majel Barrett was supposed to do the voice, but was unavailable. I was a last-minute replacement. Ralph Sineski said, quote, I remember the voice of the companion, which was originally very metallic and seemed unreal, with no emotion and no feeling, which didn't work. I worked with an actress who had done voiceovers, and what we found was a cadence where she would speak slowly and with not too much inflection. I think it works, and I love the way the show came out. Rogers returned to Star Trek to be seen on camera as Lieutenant Palmer, Uhura's occasional replacement, in the episodes Doomsday Machine and The Way of Eden. And I guess that must be that blonde woman. I forget. I guess that's her name. But I know there's a blonde woman who later in the series kind of pops in from time to time at the communications station. Okay. See. Okay. So there's one magic element to be added to Metamorphosis, and that is the music. George, and I guess it's Dunning. It's only one N instead of two N's. So I don't know if it's Duning or Dunning. I'm going to say Dunning. Began his association with Star Trek with the scoring of this episode. Justman hired Dunning on the strength of his numerous romantic film scores, including 1957's Picnic and 1953's From Here to Eternity. Dunning received 2 of his 5 Oscar nominations for those films. Dunning said, quote, I was still working at Columbia Pictures as a contract composer, and Robert Justman had become one of my fans through my motion picture scores. He called and asked whether they could borrow me occasionally to do Star Trek, which there were, and those were a lot of fun. Despite keeping the production down to 6 days, Metamorphosis ended up costing $198,493. Just under 1.4 million in 2013 dollars. The studio mandated budget of 185,000 per episode was looking to be unrealistic. With the first 2 episodes of the new season having gone over budget, Star Trek now had a deficit of $45,708. Desilu was expecting some future episodes to cost less to compensate for this overspending. Okay, NBC did not want the atypical Metamorphosis programmed too early into the new season, in a time slot where the network expected the audience would be more young kids. On June 21st, Stanley Robinson wrote to Gene Roddenberry, quote, our feelings that neither Metamorphosis nor Catspaw should be scheduled as one of the 4 or 5 programs to begin our season. As you recall, after viewing both rough cuts, we felt that while both were acceptable episodes, they were not truly representative of the excitement and the wide audience appeal that our series will have. Cat's Paw had always been intended to air the week of Halloween. Metamorphosis, per NBC's wishes, was delayed and slated to be the 9th episode to beam across the airwaves. Eleanor Donahue recalled, quote, I remember watching it at home, and I am quite often nervous about watching something I'm in because there's nothing you can do about it once it's out there. But I was very pleased with it, very happy. Sadly, the overall audience was not that large, at least according to the Nielsen ratings. So the episode aired, Friday, November 10th, 67. And in the first half hour from 8:30 to 9, it was third in the ratings, getting a 21.4 audience share behind Hondo, which had a 26 share, and Gomer Pyle, which had a 42.4% audience share. So nearly half the country was watching Gomer. And then in the second half hour from 9 to 9:30, it was third again, but this time behind a series called Man in a Suitcase on ABC and the CBS Friday Night Movie, which led with a 38.4% audience share. However, Metamorphosis did receive an Emmy nomination for its photographic effects. Now, this episode did air or did fare better when it was rerun in the summer. It appeared, it did a repeat episode or repeat broadcast on July 19th of 68. And at that time, it received a 24.6 audience share and was second in the ratings. Again, behind Gomer, which had a 45.7 audience share this time. And then second in the with a 25.2% audience share in the second half hour, again behind the Friday Night Movie. The movie on CBS was a repeat of 1961's Portrait of a Mobster, starring Vic Morrow, and directed by Star Trek's own Joseph Pevney. ABC's new contender by this point in the season, a mid-season replacement show, was called Man in a Suitcase, starring Richard Bradford as a former U.S. intelligence agent working as a private detective and traveling the world, living out of his suitcase. The critics and writers for Cinefantastique, in an issue of the magazine devoted to Star Trek, picked Metamorphosis as being among the top 10 episodes from the original series. DeForest Kelley also considered this one of his favorite episodes. Let's see. Oh, okay. Now, Gene Roddenberry received a fan letter from November 1967. Quote, at this writing, there have been 10 episodes of the new season. I grant you that number 5, The Apple, didn't trek very well. The immediate previous episode, Jerome Bixby's Mirror Mirror, was absolutely tops. The worst one to date is a staff job credited to producer Gene Kuhn. His Metamorphosis made idiots out of all the cast, particularly violating practically all the characterizations. At WestCon 67, I took Harlan Ellison's denunciation of Gene L. Kuhn as, quote, Mr. Mediocrity with a grain of salt, having read a book by Kuhn called The Short End, which was not exactly bland or predictable. But Kuhn's Star Trek episode was the sheerest chunk of soap opera ever foisted on this program. It just plain stunk. Signed Buzz from Seattle, Washington. So Buzz kind of agreed with me. In absolute disagreement with Buzz, DC Fontana loved the episode. Quote, Metamorphosis to me is a very affecting and touching script. I loved it. Eleanor Donahue said she was, quote, very pleased, and perhaps more importantly, in memory of her late husband, she said that, quote, it was Harry's most favorite thing that I ever did. Harry Ackerman told this author, quote, no one who ever saw Father's Knows Best can forget Eleanor and her character from that series, and she was given many delightful performances. But that Star Trek touched my heart. I was very proud of her when I saw it. Ralph Sineski said, quote, this was my favorite. That show just rolled off like clockwork. It was just such a joy to do, and I was very into it. Metamorphosis struck me as the most poetic and imaginative show that I did. So, as I say, I'm not the biggest fan of this episode. There's just a lot of stuff in it that honestly doesn't add up and doesn't make the most sense. Now, admittedly, some of it is from the rewrites. Now, they Cushman talks about how, the whole theme of this episode is kind of going against what he's racial prejudice, as he says it. But I think that's a poor way to describe it. Now, prejudice in general, I can kind of get, but even then, I think it kind of falls flat because, of course, the whole idea is that he rejects the love of this alien being, and then in the end, he falls in love with the alien. So, oh, he overcomes his prejudices. But the whole point is that he doesn't want a romantic relationship with this being because it's not human. It's a cloud. First of all, the whole thing of this cloud being female doesn't make any sense. It's a cloud. It has no, with all the talk in recent years about, what is a woman? What makes a woman a woman? What makes something male or female? How do you define gender? And yet here we got this cloud that has no sexual characteristics at all, and they're saying, oh, well, it's human because it has a female voice. Why does it have a female voice? Well, because it just because the script says it has a female voice. That's why. It doesn't make any sense. But then on top of that, we've got this whole notion that he's overcoming his prejudice to fall in love with the alien. But he doesn't fall in love with the alien until it inhabits the body of this, very pretty, very lovely human woman. So how is he really overcoming prejudice? It's basically like, okay, I'll love you now that you're more like me, or now that you're a proper woman, basically. And look, I understand why at the time they did this episode, they had to do it that way. There were certain limitations and certain, of course, boundaries they couldn't go beyond, certainly for network television in those days. But I think that just highlights how the story is kind of weak because now, years later, I mean, personally, I look at it and I see this obvious flaw in the story. And I think that just highlights how kind of weak it really is, in my opinion. And that's kind of my main thing. There are some other quibbles here and there. But yeah, overall, I give this one what I say. I think I said I gave it a C. It's not a terrible episode, but to me, it's very, very kind of eh. Um, like I say, it wouldn't make my list of favorite episodes. Maybe some of you guys, if you really like it. And Eddie says, I never liked the Nancy Hedford character. I always felt like she came off overly arrogant and overly dramatic. Maybe that can be explained away by her illness, but I didn't like the character. Yeah. Um, well, she does come across as, she is very kind of touchy and kind of disagreeable, early in the episode. But again, I think that's supposed to be the point of her character. She's this very kind of a woman who's very, I guess, emotionally kind of closed off. She's a career woman, and she even talks about that. And I think that's kind of part of her. Actually, I was thinking how this episode, to me, honestly, it doesn't really. It's almost like it's not really a Star Trek episode. It's like this episode is like some kind of odd kind of mashup of Star Trek and Love American style. Because you've got these two people who are both, it's like they don't have anybody, and at the end of the episode they wind up in love. It's like, gee, will she overcome her unwillingness to love a guy, and be willing to set her career aside, to fall in love with a man? And will these two crazy kids finally love each other in the end? What's going to happen? I mean, it just feels that way to me the more I think about it. It's like an episode of Love American style. Okay. And J Rocker says, I feel Let That Be Your Last Battlefield is the best episode. Dealing with prejudice. I know that is the third season, though. Yeah, I mean, like I say, the racial prejudice episode really kind of is weak here and kind of falls flat. And again, I think that's partly just because of the way, the conventions of the time, they couldn't push too far on that. But again, I mean, it's just, how is he overcoming prejudice? Because he doesn't want to love this being because it's, an alien. And then in the end, he loves her because why? Because she becomes a woman, a white woman, becomes a pretty white woman. So how is he overcoming prejudice here? I don't see it. Okay, I guess I will go ahead and wrap it up there. Yeah, we're at a little bit over an hour. So next week is the next episode is Friday's Child, and I won't be live streaming this weekend because I've got my National Guard drill. I didn't stream Sunday night. I don't know if any of you noticed, but I didn't Sunday night because a couple of days earlier, I had AT&T come over and they were going to switch my Wi-Fi over to fiber optic cable because they're telling me higher download speeds and all, and I really have it takes forever for me to upload videos, so I figured it was worth it to make the change. And long story short, they screwed up something, and I was actually without internet for, I don't know, almost 24 hours, and we couldn't get it working Sunday night. Actually, the fiber optic still doesn't work. It's still out. I'm back on my broadband network. So, and I'm just going to stay on this. Maybe next week I'll have them come back over and see if they can get that working. But anyway, yeah. So I should be doing the episode next week, though. So until then, everyone, again, thanks for stopping by. Again, if you haven't liked the stream, please do like it before you leave and sub to the channel. I did put my review of Captain America and Brave New World up on my channel. If you haven't seen that, please do check that out. And until then, thank you for stopping by, Jay Rocker. Always appreciate you being here, sir. Thank you. Until then, everyone have a good evening, and I guess I'll see you next week.